Hi guys, this is Drew Brashler with DBB Audio. I'm continuing my new version 4 series on the Behringer X32, and today we're going to be talking about the physical inputs and outputs of the board, and just really how to get an XLR with a microphone plugged into your board and passing audio. So let's go ahead and jump in. The Behringer X32 is a 40 input console. Now you're probably thinking, how is that possible? There's only 32 inputs on the back of the board. Well, there's 32 XLR inputs, and then there's an additional 6 auxiliary inputs that are 1/4 inch TRS or TS, balanced or unbalanced, line level inputs. Now that's a lot to say, so let's go ahead and just dive in and take a look at them. So I have a camera set up here at the back of the board with my XLR inputs, followed by the auxiliary inputs and then also auxiliary outputs down on the bottom. So we have these 6 channels, and these are 1/4 inch inputs. Now this is a balanced TRS signal, but it can also accept an unbalanced TS signal. Now, I would not suggest plugging in an acoustic guitar to these because these do require a line level signal. Now over here we have these RCA inputs, which is very helpful if we're ever wanting to plug in an iPod. And so what I will do is I will grab an 1/8 inch stereo to a RCA stereo and plug this into the back of the board, plug this into my iPod, and now I have my iPod hooked into my console, landing here on my auxiliary ins on 5 and 6. I will go ahead and link these two, and that is my iPod input that I always use every time I use the Behringer X32. If you are wanting to plug in an acoustic guitar or a bass guitar into this console, the auxiliary inputs are not going to be the way that you'll want to plug it in. The reasoning for that is the auxiliary inputs are a line level only signal. And so if you take an acoustic guitar or a bass guitar, those pickups are going to want a high impedance load. And these line level inputs will give a lower impedance load of about 20,000 ohms. And that's going to cause your acoustic guitar or your bass guitar or electric guitar, basically anything that has a pickup in it, and it's actually going to change the tonality of that instrument in a very bad way. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to get a direct box. Now direct box, there's a couple different types. There's an active and passive, and there's a bunch of different ones out there, and I will make sure to post on my blog, dbbaudio.com, a couple ones that I recommend. I have a very beat up old direct box here. This is a Whirlwind Director direct box, and this is a passive direct box, which means passive means there is a transformer inside of this DI box that will take the high impedance of your acoustic and turn it into a low impedance output that will then go and plug into your XLR inputs on the board. Now there's also active, which means that there's going to be active circuitry inside of this DI box, which will require phantom power or a battery inside of the DI box to actually do that transfer of the high impedance load to the low impedance load. All right, so how do we get this to work? Well, let's go ahead and plug it in. So we grab our 1/4 inch from our acoustic guitar and plug it into the input of the DI box. One benefit of a DI box is it has this really cool function of a ground lift switch. So if you do have an instrument, for instance a keyboard, that when you plug it into your PA system and through your soundboard, it gives this hum. Well, a direct box is going to allow you to break that ground loop hum in a very safe way. Never, ever try to fix a ground loop using a ground lift off of the actual plug of the electricity. It's very dangerous, and you can actually cause someone to die because of it. So always use a DI box for lifting the ground of an instrument that has a ground loop problem. So grab your instrument, plug it into the input, and then grab an XLR cable. Plug one end into the output of your direct box, and then that will then plug into, for today, input 1 on the back of our board. And because this is a passive direct box, it does not need phantom power, but let's go ahead and do the tap test. So I'm going to go ahead and select my channel 1. I am going to turn up the gain on it, and I'm just going to tap on the end of this, and we can see that there is signal there. So that is how we would plug in an acoustic guitar, a keyboard, bass guitar, or any other unbalanced 1/4 inch instrument that you want to plug into your console. Now what about a microphone? Well, microphones they are XLR based. So we're just going to grab a microphone, plug it into an XLR, and plug it into the back of our console. Now, if your microphone needs phantom power, then you would need to go ahead and turn on phantom power. And we can do that by selecting our channel, pressing view on that channel, and then pressing 48 volts in the upper left-hand corner of the board. Do not turn on phantom power for microphones that do not need it. There are transformers in most microphones to block that DC power from damaging the element of the microphone. However, there are some old microphones, for instance, ribbon microphones, where if you did apply phantom power, you can actually destroy the microphone. We don't want to do that. So only turn on phantom power for the channels that need it. Mostly that's going to be small diaphragm condensers, large diaphragm condensers, or any active circuitry requiring phantom power like a DI box. So we can go ahead and plug in our microphone, check, 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 and we can see that, oh, my gain's a little bit too high, so I'm going to go ahead and turn my gain down. So I'm going to go ahead and select my channel, press view on the configuration preamp spot, and then turn my gain down so that when my average volume of me talking to this is hovering right around the -18 light, which would be the first yellow light in this meter. And what this gives me is a lot of headroom, is what we call it, which is the amount of room between your signal and the clip. Now, clip happens if we distort our board. And clipping sounds like distortion. Distortion's bad. It can damage your speakers if you have too much of it, and it's just not very pleasant. So we want to make sure that we have a lot of headroom in case a musician all of a sudden speaks very loudly into this microphone, like shouting, then we aren't clipping that channel. Now, what if we have our Behringer X32 sitting at front of house, and our stage is all the way up a couple hundred feet away from us, and we're wanting to plug in a whole bunch of microphones up on that stage. Well, that's where a remote input box like the Mida's DL32 or the Behringer S32 would come in handy using a very cool thing called AES-50. So let's go ahead and start talking about that next. AES-50 is what Behringer X32 and the Midas family of the M32 uses to talk to its remote stage boxes. It is a digital audio protocol that is 48 channels bidirectional, which means I can send 48 channels in and 48 channels out over the same cable, which is very cool. It's owned by Clark Technic, and it's also called SuperMac. Now, the audio is carried over a shielded Cat5e or better cable. Now, by shielded, that means that the cable has a shield that is running over the entire length of that network cable, and Cat5e is going to be the category rating or speed of that network cable. Now, you can use a Cat6 or higher cable, but it just has to be shielded. It really needs to be shielded, and it is recommended to have the Ethercon barrel on the end for stability, robustness, and for a little bit better shield over your connection of your digital protocol. Now, this cable can connect to your remote stage box 100 meters away, or a little bit over 300 feet. If you do need to go farther than that, you can use another AES-50 device to then take it as an input and then take that output out of the AES device and send it even farther. So, for instance, if we had this remote stage box 200 meters away from us, we could take this stage box, place it on the stage, put an X32 in the middle, have one AES-50 cable coming from that stage box into the first X32, and then take another AES-50 and plug it into our front of house console another 100 meters away and give us that 200 meters total in distance. Now, that's not very practical, so I would recommend trying to keep that distance fairly low. So let's go ahead and plug in this stage box into our X32. Went ahead and plugged in one side of the Ethercon cable into the A port of the AES-50 on this DL32. Next, I'm going to take this and plug it into the A port on my console. And that's it. Now we just have to do a little bit of routing inside of the menu structure of our X32. We can do that in our routing tab. So that is your third button down. We'll go ahead and press routing. And all of the input blocks here are currently on local. By default, your Behringer X32, when you first initialize it, will have it on local. Now, local stands for the local inputs on the actual physical surface of your X32, being the local inputs on the back of the board. Anything else can be selected via our routing blocks. Now, this stage box is being plugged into our AES50A port on this console, which means that I need to route all of my inputs from AES50A 1 through 32 because there's 32 channels and I'm wanting to route all 32 channels. Well, what if I only want to route 16? Well, then only select 16 of those channels and then you can use the rest of the 16 in a different area. Well, what if I only want to have one locally and 31 on my remote stage box? Well, you'll have to wait for that next video. That's going to be on the user routing, which gives us one-to-one patching, which means that I can take 31 inputs from this remote stage box and a single input from here and have all of them coming into my console. Now, that's one of the great features of this version 4 firmware for the X32. Previous versions of the firmware, say 1, 2, or 3, would only allow you to take blocks of 8, which means that I could take 8, 16, 24, or 32 inputs from this, and I would have to choose which ones I'm not going to accept on the board. So let's go ahead and route all of our audio inputs from AES50A. So to do that, I'm going to press routing, tab over to input, and I'm going to go select AES50A 1 through 8, 9 through 16, 17 through 24, 25 through 32. Now, if I am wanting to record these channels on my expansion card with a computer plugged into the USB, I need to do another set of routing because all of my inputs are now coming from this stage box and not from the local inputs. But if we tab over to our card, what we'll notice is that all of these are still being sourced from our local inputs. So this is a big mistake that I see a lot of churches accidentally doing, is they have their stage box sitting up on stage and they're going and they want to do a multi-track recording and they hit record and then they have nothing except blank audio. And that's because they're trying to record their local channels instead of their remote stage box. So let's go ahead and tab over to card, and we're going to set this to AES50A 1 through 8, 9 through 16, 17 through 24, 25 through 32. Now, if you did plug in your remote stage box into your B port, you would want to select your B port for this. If you had one S16 plugged into your A port and another S16 plugged into your B port, you would want to select 1 through 16 on both ports, meaning that I would go ahead and select AES50A 1 through 16, and then AES50B 1 through 16. Now, that's not the case for us here, as I have a DL32, which gives us all 32 inputs over that AES50. So we're going to go back to 17 through 24, 25 through 32, and now I'm ready to plug in an input. So let's go ahead and plug in an input into input 1 here. So I have my microphone and an XLR. Going to plug it into input 1, and I'm going to go select my input 1 here. Press view. I can see that it's being routed from A01, which means that's AES50A port 1, and I can start talking into this microphone. And then I can go ahead and apply some more gain and get it up to that -18 sweet spot. Hey, check, check, check. Awesome. Now we have our input routed. Now I can go ahead and plug in an input into 16 here. And same thing. A16 is right there, and let's apply a little bit of gain here. Check, check, check. Perfect. That's as simple as it is to get inputs from a remote stage box into our console. Let's go ahead and start talking about outputs next. The Behringer X32 has 16 XLR outputs on the back of the physical board. That's going to be the full size. Any of the smaller sizes of the console, for instance, the producer or the compact, are going to have 8 XLR outputs. All versions of the X32 also have an additional aux outputs of 6, which are going to be the TRS or TS, balanced or unbalanced quarter-inch outputs. Let's go ahead and take a look at the XLR first. So we can see here on this camera shot that I have my XLR outputs 1 through 8 and 9 through 16. Now, by default, 15 and 16 are going to be your left and right output out of the board. If you have a smaller version of the board, for instance, the compact or the producer, 7 and 8 is going to be by default set as your left-right output. Now, one mistake I unfortunately see a lot of people doing is plugging in their main PA into their control room or monitor output of the board. And what will happen is when you go and solo a channel, it will actually solo it in your house because you have your entire house PA plugged into your control room output. Now, this is an incorrect way of doing that. You want to use the 7 and 8 if you have a smaller version of the board, or the 15 and 16 on the full size of the board for sending out your main PA to your left-right. The control room monitor output is strictly for a near-field set of monitors that you're wanting to listen to that you can solo up an input and listen to those in those speakers. Now, additionally, the monitors will show up on the headphone outputs, which happen to be in the handles of the X32. Now we do have our monitor level, which controls the volume output out of this control room out in the upper right-hand corner of the board. Additionally, the phones level, which will control the volume of the headphones on the sides. If you're wanting to route something to one of these XLR outputs on the local portion of the board, all you have to do is simply page over until you get to your patch points. Now, we have analog outputs 1 through 16, and we can go ahead and use our rotary knob and select an output. So for instance, if I was wanting to place my left-right output on 4 and 5, all we would do is scroll to output 4, and then I would go and select it in this out signal, so main left, and I would assign. And I want that to be post fader so that it can control the volume of the output. And then let's go ahead and set 5 to being our main right and post fader. Oh, actually, I accidentally set that up wrong. I have 4 and 5 as my output monitors on my mix bus 1 and 2. So let's go ahead and route those real quick. So we'll go back to output 4, and this is actually a mix bus 1, and I want that on post fader so I can have control over that volume. And output 5 is supposed to be mix bus 2. You can see that it's very simple to place these outputs, but what if we wanted to have these outputs show up on our DL32 that's sitting up on the stage? Well, we can set that by setting our outputs 1 through 16 here, and then we can tab over to our AES50A, which is where we have our DL32 plugged in on the console, and then outputs 1 through 16, the first set here, is going to be what shows up on our outputs of the DL32. So if I wanted to have my outputs 1 through 16 showing up on the DL32, I would want to have outputs 1 through 8 and 9 through 16 selected on my first 16 channels of that AES50A outputs, because this is an output portion of the board going over that EtherCon connection to my stage box. So remember that 48 in, 48 out. Well, this is our 48 channels out of our console going to our DL32. Another very popular thing is using the Ultranet output. Now, the Ultranet output is on the back of the X32 as well as the back of the DL32 or any of the remote stage boxes. And this allows you to interface with the Behringer P16 monitoring system, which is a personal monitoring system which allows the musician to mix their own mix. Now, let's go ahead and set up our outputs from the board to go ahead and feed that. We can do that by pressing routing and then tabbing over until we get to P16. Now we can see P16-1 output, and I can start pulling this from either direct out of channels, or I could even pull this off of mix buses. And there's a lot of different tap points here as well. So I could choose pre-EQ if I was wanting to have everything be before the EQ, or I could choose post-EQ or pre-fader. There's a lot of different tap options. And if you do have any questions on how those actually route to this with those different taps, go ahead and check out my blog. I have a blog post on there at dbbaudio.com that you can check out and read all about that. Now, one thing that we do need to make sure of is in our routing on the AES50A page is that our patch points on the outputs of 33 through 48 are being sourced from P16 1 through 16. If this is set to anything else, your P16 monitoring system that you plug in on the Ultranet on the stage rack is going to be not what you expect it to be. If you had, for instance, card output 1 through 8 and output 9 through 16, well, now on your P16 monitoring system, your outputs 1 through 16 are going to be showing up there instead of the Ultranet. Let's talk about the remaining connections on the back of the X32. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the expansion card, which is right here. Now, most Behringer X32s ship with either the XUF or the XUSB card inserted on the X32. The XUF is going to be a FireWire or USB 32 in, 32 out expansion card, which means that all my 32 inputs and 32 outputs can be routed through that card into a laptop via the USB. The XUSB is going to be a USB interface only. And then there's this really cool card, which I actually have inserted on my X32 called the X Live, which allows me to record 32 channels to an SD card locally on this console. And then I can actually play those 32 channels back into my console if I want to do a virtual sound check, for instance. Or if you were wanting to just have that backup of having a really robust recording of 32 channels going into that SD card, there is also a USB connection on that, which means that I can record those 32 channels additionally to a laptop. So now I have a robust recording on the SD card as well as a backup on the laptop. Now, there are a bunch of different types of expansion cards available for the X32, including Dante, Waves integrations, Midi cards. I actually have a blog post dedicated to all the expansion cards that are available on the market for the X32, which you can check out at my blog. The next thing that you'll see here is the remote portion. Now, there's a USB that is not used anymore, and then there's also a Ethernet connection, which allows us to remote connect into this console using the software available for your computer or even an iPad or a tablet. Now, you will need to do some networking on your console, but I actually have a blog post dedicated to that on my blog, so go check that out as well. Now you can see the next thing that we have is our Midi in and out, and then we have our AES EBU output, as well as our Ultranet output. The very last thing that we have on the back of the board, which is a very long reach from here, is our auxiliary outputs. Now the auxiliary outputs are going to be 6/4 inch TRS or TS if you wanted the unbalanced, and those are there for you, as well as 2 RCA outputs. Now the RCA jacks I love to plug into a camera if we have a camera that needs to have a little bit of recording, or plug it into a CD recorder or another type of recording device. Now if you are wanting to route audio to that, that is in a completely separate portion than the outputs 1 through 16 and allows you to send dedicated outputs to that. So let's go ahead and check that out real quick. Go ahead and press routing, page over to patch points, and locate your aux. And we can see that we have aux 1 through 6, as well as our AES EBU left and right. And that brings us to the conclusion of the video on the connections of the X32. As you can tell, there's a lot of input and output options available for this console. So if you do find yourself in a little bit of confusion, feel free to jump over to my blog, as I have a blog post dedicated to the input and output options available for the X32. Make sure to like or subscribe this video and my channel, and if you have any questions, feel free to post below. But thank you so much for watching, and I will be releasing a whole bunch of more videos on the version 4 firmware update that Behringer released for this X32. Thank you so much.